You may have spoken about this previously, but I would love to hear how you handle trunk rotation for people who are in rotational sports, golfers, tennis. Another amazing question, Shane. I appreciate you asking it. I'm just getting into working with a lot more rotational athletes. Where I work physically, aside from the internet, Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare. Check them out. We have a lot of pro golfers who train with us and amateur golfers. And my buddy Brian Chandler and Brad Thompson, I'll link them both in the show notes. You definitely want to follow them because they're smart cookies. We've been applying a lot of the concepts with our golfers on the rehab side of things and the training side of things. And it's been actually really cool to see because those guys weren't exposed to a lot of the concepts that I talk about, just at least the surface level, but having some mentored application of this stuff has led to some profound effects with some of our rotational athletes. Like some of our golfers have seen changes in club speed, feel, less aches and pains. It's really cool. It's been really cool to see. So the question then is, well, Zach, what are you doing differently for these types of athletes? The answer is a whole lot of nothing. It's the same poop. It's funny, as I've been evaluating a lot of these golfers, and I'm blown away that they can do what they do, because a lot of them have severe restrictions in hip rotation. They don't rotate through the trunk. They don't have much motion in their shoulders, yet they're driving the ball like crazy. They're hitting these amazing putts under pressure. Like it's phenomenal how well they can do what they do despite having movement restrictions. And it kind of makes me question, like, man, what is our relevancy? But the cool thing though is I see that, but then I also see the cool changes that we've gotten, like in terms of club speed, how they're feeling, with very simple stuff. Most of the last few months that I've been working there, the golfers have predominantly been working on stacking. And think of it this way. I don't know if this is accurate, but it makes sense to me. In most joints in the human body, the closed pack position is more extension. When I'm in extension, I'm going to lose the ability to move in multiple directions, or when I hit more of the closed pack position. So if I can do activities that get me out of that position, that promote more flexion, that promote more expansion through the ventral cavity, that's going to free up your ability to twist and rotate by default, because it opens up more motion. And because these athletes are so good at rotating already in a compensatory scenario, that when you give them just a little bit of movement freedom, it can be a complete game changer. Nothing really changes in the initial phases of working with rotational athletes. You have to teach them the stack component, especially because if you now go into some of the stuff that I talk about before and now, if you're going to be teaching shifting and rotating through the trunk and they don't have that stack capability, guess what's going to happen? They're going to arch their back. They're going to stick their butt out like the Jennifer Lopez or Kim Kardashian, whoever you prefer. They're going to flatten their upper back, and that's going to minimize their ability to rotate. So they're going to go back into compensation nation. You don't want to be living there. So get them to stack first. Rule of thumb, and, obviously I break the rules sometimes, but if you can get some of these folks to squat parallel and it looks pretty good, I think that's a really good point to start introducing some shifting work. Because that's ultimately where you're going to have to go to drive rotation through the trunk and the hips. Because when you are doing shifting, you are inducing rotation through the trunk. So working on your ability to shift, that's a great way to restore thoracic rotation. Check the stuff that I'm going to be sharing on the show notes. If you got someone and you're working on the stack and you still want to introduce some rotation with low risk of not having good movement, doing anything single arm in the upper body is a money way of doing that. Most of the people who I work with, especially in the early phases, aren't doing any bilateral pushing and pulling. I have them doing mostly unilateral stuff where they're alternating, one side at a time if it's pushes or pulls. Same thing with pull downs. All of that usually starts unilaterally and alternating, because when I do something unilaterally, I can induce some degree of rotation. And if I induce a little bit of rotation, that can allow me to restore some of the movement options needed to rotate in these sports, especially because most people are restricted anteriorly and posteriorly in the thorax. If I can find safe ways to introduce rotation into their lives, that's going to potentially help them quite a bit from a performance aspect. Another great safe way to introduce rotation in the early phases without shifting would be carries. If you hold a weight and then you're swinging your arm as violently and as through large excursions, that's going to promote rotating the trunk with each swing. As I raise my arm forward, my trunk's going to rotate to the right. As I swing my arm back, my trunk's going to rotate to the left, if we're talking about the left arm being the swinging arm. Doing anything like that can also be a way to incorporate trunk rotation. And a lot of times, just doing those simple things can lead to profound improvements in their ability to rotate, because they've rotated at a high level through a compensatory strategy. So they might not be able to do well at the low level stuff that gets them out of that compensatory strategy. So stay the course, start low, start with stacking, work on rotation through a low level by doing single arm stuff or carries. And then once they can squat parallel, then you can think about doing more shifting based work through the lower extremities. And doing those things, working in that sequence, slow cooking the brisket, as I always say, should lead to some profound changes in your rotational athletes.